Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And yeah, we look like we are live, hopefully.
We look like we're live. We're not sure.
As you may notice, I'm wearing this hanging stuff today.
Just like me.
Just 30 minutes ago, the entire block went blackout, completely blackout. So hopefully we are going to make it to the end. I don't know what's happening in Italy, but we just lost the power. There was a power outage here in the block for 10 minutes or maybe even less.
We have a conspiracy theory about Russian energy, but we're not going to get into it now. Welcome to another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show, where we talk about politics, sometimes death and destruction, but also fun things. And so today we have a very special guest whom we are going to bring on momentarily. He is an Austrian historian, journalist, translator, publisher. He's got a long resume. His name is Alexander Marcovics. He is the founder, the chairman, and the first spokesperson of the identitarian movement in Europe in the 2012 to 2017 period. His academic background is in history, but he surpasses that in terms of his intellectual and professional pursuits. He is an editor of Deutsche Stimme publication, and he's also an editor-in-chief of another publication called Agora Europa. And if I mispronounced or mistranslated anything, I'm sure he will correct me. One more. Marcelo, let's bring him on.
Let's bring him on. Nina, can you check your YouTube studio now? Because I think your YouTube connection went down. Your Twitter X, it's working. Mm-hmm. I have your live stream, but on YouTube, it has gone down. It looks like it has gone down.
It's gone down. It just says the show is coming soon, so I don't know if you need to reconnect it.
Okay, let's, yeah. Is it back?
Yeah, it says coming soon, so hopefully.
No, yeah, you have to check your YouTube studio.
It says coming soon, so.
All right. In Twitter, we're going. It's all fine there. I'm checking it now. Okay, so let's bring our guest in the middle of chaos. I'm sorry for that, sir. Oh, yeah, I have to. This is the most chaos we ever had.
Thanks to the power outage, apparently.
Yeah. So now we have the scene working. We have our guest Alexander Marcovics. I'm sorry, I lost this part. I didn't have the earplugs on me at the time. Welcome, sir. Good afternoon, and I'm terribly sorry for all that. Please forgive me.
Well, we can blame it. We can blame it on the Italian power outage, and possibly, like our conspiracy theory suggested, something to do with Russian energy. This might be a direct consequence or an indirect consequence. But yes, welcome. Really excited to have you here. I've been following your work for quite some time. So please, first of all, correct me if I misintroduced you in any way, and if you need to add anything to your biography that our viewers might want to know, please do so.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor for me to join you today. As far as I know, the introduction was absolutely correct, and also a great German pronunciation from your part, Nina. Did you learn German by yourself, or?
I've taken a little bit of German in grad school where I had to have a certain number of languages. And then I kind of did a little bit of it on my own, but I do not have any speaking practice. So for instance, I can read a newspaper and I can understand not everything, but some things, not as well as French, but I really can't speak. So this is just not something that I have speaking practice with.
I see.
But I'm not, I would just say I'm not unfamiliar with it. I have taken a little bit before, so.
Okay, great. Yeah, the only thing I have to correct is I'm not a publisher at the moment, but I'm going to in the next few months. So this is still work in progress, but yeah, I'm going to be there soon.
Okay, very good. Well, I would say your editorial pursuits kind of fall within the publishing category. So this is kind of what I was thinking of, but it sounds like you have quite a bit on your plate. So usually when we see your public biography, you're introduced as someone who had a connection to the new right. But then ultimately, it sounds like you've headed into the direction of multipolarity, Eurasianism, and a couple of other movements that surpass the traditional modern ideologies, the traditional political compass. So I wanted to know, well, first, how you describe your own political views in the realm of ideology, where you came from, where you are now, and what were some influences upon your thinking before we get into some other questions.
Of course. Yeah, so first of all, to begin with, my political awakening or the forming of my political consciousness actually started back in 2001 when I was, just more or less still a child and starting to interest myself for history, for politics. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And it's very interesting because this event not only had great repercussions in the United States itself, but of course also in Europe. And led to several never-ending wars, this heyday of US-American neoconservatism and everything. But of course, these events started to let me think about what's happening around in the world, and also started me to becoming more and more critical about the United States of America. Of course, back in those days, I didn't start from the right, but the first political authors I think I've read at that time have been, for example, some kind of soft anti-imperialists like Michael Moore, who was back in those days a big critique of the Bush administration. And I think you could not imagine today anymore those days in 2001 when, especially in Europe, with the axis of Chirac, Schröder, and then Putin, which was imagined, there was really some kind of anti-American bloc emerging, or at least it seemed so. And of course, this was also, you could see that in the public sphere. You could see that there were a lot of intellectuals who are critical of the role of the United States of America and George W. Bush especially. And therefore, there was at least the potential of a sovereign Europe somehow emancipating itself from the United States of America. Now, 20 years later, you could say that these developments didn't materialize, and that nowadays you have Europe totally dependent on the United States, clearly under the thumb of Washington. And even in the United States itself, most of these old critiques of George W. Bush have now become proponents of globalism, of the unipolar system themselves. But of course, this was some kind of starting point for me in 2001 to become critical and more critical about the role of the United States in the world. And I was then, let's say, further radicalized by my own education at my high school in Vienna, which was, of course, full of more left-leaning globalist teachers. And back in those days in Vienna, you had a surprisingly fundamental oppositionist party like FPÖ back in those old days. when Heinz Christian Strache rescued FPÖ from becoming totally obsolete. And yeah, these things fascinated me. All this talk about the role of the European Union in destroying the sovereignty of Austria, the topic of mass migration, these were basically the things which first made me think about politics, of course, besides the events of 9/11. And yeah, with the course of those years, with realizing what was going on inside FPÖ, with all those hardcore Zionists more and more ruling the party, and of course, unfortunately, the promise of power leading all these people away from their former role as opposition leader against the European Union, and then, like, for example, Strache becoming a toothless tiger. This all made me think. It made me think about what's going wrong in Europe. And yeah, all this thinking led me basically to the European New Right, or the French Nouvelle Droite, which I think you nowadays definitely have to separate from most of the German New Right, because unfortunately this school of thought of Alain de Benoit has so far not materialized in party politics, but unfortunately the label has been used to simply put it on every new right movement, so on every new movement from the right, and therefore you have all these neoliberal Zionist and, yeah, to some degree even white supremacist movements now being labeled New Right. Unfortunately, because the New Right itself is neither white supremacist, it's neither neoliberal, and it's also definitely not in favor of unipolarity, but on the contrary, it's, as Professor Alexander Dugin has said, it's more the European version of fourth political theory. And yeah, this is basically my political home. So if I would have to define myself in terms of philosophy and politics, I would say that I'm a proponent of the European New Right in the spirit of Alain de Benoit, and of course also of fourth political theory in the spirit of Professor Dugin. And furthermore, I'm a proponent of multipolarity. And if you are, putting it into philosophical categories, of course, I'm a follower of the Apollonian and the Dionysian logos, in the sense of European tradition, which was also heavily theorized by Julius Evola and René Guénon. So this is basically my political background. Of course, I've been also part of the identitarian movement from 2012 to 2017. It was basically a try to actually bring these ideas of the European New Right to life in form of a political movement, in form of a youth movement, which was actually something we wanted to achieve. But unfortunately, if you combine this with the protests against mass migration and then go into the wrong direction, you unfortunately end up in some kind of neoconservative ideology. And nowadays, the identitarian movement is no longer on this path of multipolarity and ideas of the new right, but it's more on path of the ideas of Tommy Robinson, you could say. Maybe also you could say Andrew Tate. So it totally went, it derailed, it totally went off the tracks, and it's now today more neoconservative, the new right. So I took my lessons from that and said, okay, maybe activism is not the most important area we can work today, but the most important area is actually the war of ideas. The Nomakia Professor Dugin wrote 24 volumes actually about. Mm-hmm. And my aim is actually to further popularize and develop these ideas of the European New Right, of neo-Eurasianism, of the fourth political theory, and try to build up a school of thought especially in Vienna, because as we all know, one of the most well-known proponents of the original Eurasianist movement, Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, actually even lived in Vienna and taught at the university here. And I think we have to keep up this flame from Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy, from the European New Right, from Eurasianism, even also from the Conservative Revolution, and use it in order to fight this chaos, to fight unipolarity, of course, this strange kind of liberalism 2.0 currently existing and dominating the European intellectual landscape, in order to go the forest passage of Ernst Jünger and actually fight in the intellectual, spiritual resistance in the name of God against these forces of the Antichrist, of the devil, and to make our own points and make a difference. That's the idea.
And now I have 20 different questions just based on your introduction here. But you did answer the one question. My next question was going to be what happened to the identitarian movement. And I think you explained it very succinctly. When I first started reading about it, it seemed like it was supposed to be the answer to just the impact of liberalism on, atomizing communities, disconnecting people from their roots, from their traditions, et cetera, et cetera. And it seemed to be kind of like you described this activist response in an attempt to harness whatever traditions were left in different European countries, specifically in Austria, in your case. And then it almost sounds like, do you think the movement was almost hijacked? Do you think that was deliberate? Or do you think that was sort of because the movement focused on sort of symptoms instead of the causes, so they're kind of looking at mass migration without really trying to understand the deeper roots of mass migration? Do you think it got hijacked, or do you think it just kind of naturally happened that they focused on sort of like Band-Aid solutions instead of something deeper?
Well, I guess it's basically naturally developed in this direction, because unfortunately, people were thinking that we have to focus on only one topic, and this topic is mass migration, Islamization, and not thinking about everything which actually led to this development. So there's this great quote by Alain de Benoit, who said that whoever is talking about mass migration and keep silent about capitalism should keep his mouth shut, but the same thing goes vice versa. So also those people who are only talking about capitalism and are keeping silent about mass migration, they should shut up too. So the problem is that basically the identitarian movement in France, for example, also started in this direction of this cultural renewal, in this kind of try to reconnect with one's own roots. But unfortunately, they suddenly had this kind of idea that you have to become a political party, that you have to become more popular, that you have to become a mass movement who's able to conquer the streets, and therefore you have to focus on Islam and not on what actually led to the process of Islamization. And of course, this can then totally destroy your own political development and also your philosophical development. And I guess the clearest sign for all of this is, for example, the change of focus in the intellectual perspective of the French group. And it was to change from the ideas of Alain de Benoit to the ideas of the late Guillaume Faye.
Yes, I always think of that. That's a really good point.
And I think Guillaume Faye is this very good example for someone who actually started very promising, who wrote very intelligent texts about theory of hegemony, about Gramscianism from the right, and also about European tradition. And then, unfortunately, he somehow changed course and became more and more neo-conservative. Also, personally, he strived more and more for material wealth. And if you would describe it in terms of Nomachia, he somehow went away from the logos of Apollo and Dionysus and became somehow himself very Cybelian. And yeah, this is, I guess, the main problem. And therefore the movement focused on Islam, on mass migration, on
his concept of Euro-Siberia was very much like very mainstream anti-mass migration, but kind of wrapped into intellectual, wrapping paper, basically, and kind of trying to sell you something pretty mainstream under the guise of, something very philosophical. So I definitely can see why you would be disappointed. But I think for some of our North American listeners, it would be interesting to kind of maybe highlight the fact that you just quoted the French intellectual Alain de Benoit, and you mentioned his critique of capitalism. At the same time, he's considered new right. And so I think a lot of mainstream people in North America cannot comprehend the criticism of capitalism and the market, and that being done within the paradigm of the right. I think that's really interesting, because I think mainstreamers automatically associate classical liberalism, free markets, capitalism, blah, 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 within the under the umbrella of the right in North America. So if you could kind of expound on that and explain the European perspective, I think that would be really interesting.
Yes, I think many people new to political thought make the mistake that they see liberalism and capitalism as two from another separated phenomena. So if you look closely at both phenomena, you see that you can't actually separate liberalism and capitalism, because liberalism as itself focus on the individual as its political subject, and the very idea of the individual is actually a human being being liberated from all its community bounds. So first you separate the individual from God, then you separate man from his people, from his family, then from the gender, and at the very end, even the individual itself is not liberated enough, and we come to the ideas of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, and then you even have to smash the individual and basically destroy it in its very parts, and then you have the revolt of the eyes against the Hitlerism of the brain and of the fingers and everything, and then you come to the individual. So this is the very idea of liberalism, to liberate the human as much as possible, and also to subjugate him to economic principles. So human as such is fortunately not an anti-religious, anti-community being, but the very development of Western history of thought, of Western intellectual history, has man led to become a being separated from the idea of community. And this is actually what started with liberalism already at the end of the Middle Ages, when this idea of the bourgeois entered the world, and when, as a consequence of the growth, for example, of the cities in Western Europe, in England, in Northern Germany, the Netherlands, etc., people started to become more and more wealthy. They rediscovered the atomist thoughts from antiquity with Lucretius and other authors like Democrit, and said, okay, the very subject of our society should no longer be God. It should no longer be centered around Christianity, but we need to center it around economic wealth, around the idea of maximum personal freedom, so that in order we can end all this religious strife, the civil wars, which is basically the idea of Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan. And this forming of the bourgeoisie actually led to the dethroning of the clergy, of the nobility, and therefore of the destruction of the traditional European society. And this gave birth to the capitalist economic system, because the capitalist economic system itself has no God itself, of course, besides money and materiality, but it has no God in sense of morality, and therefore totally centers on acquiring wealth, and even acquiring wealth without any moral constraints. And therefore you need to destroy society, therefore you need to destroy the community, you need to destroy all traditional identities in order to actually create this individual. Because, of course, people like Thomas Hobbes say that the individual is some kind of natural state of the human being, and that just afterwards you form a society, and therefore you can diminish the horrors of the war of all against all, but it's actually the other way around. You first need to create the individual so that you can create a modern state, and this is what basically happened in Europe, and which actually led to this loss of identity, this destruction of communities. And at the very moment today, we are not just witnessing the beginning of this whole process. So this current horrors of postmodernity, this gender ideology, these policies of mass migration, of endless wars, this is all actually rooted in this thinking of modernity, which of course was not something new, which originated at the end of the Middle Ages, but was actually a continuation of atomist thinking. And therefore you have to say that this process, this phenomenon of liberalism is just a culmination of this political thinking of the bourgeoisie, which already originated at the end of the Middle Ages and then became an official political ideology basically in the 18th and 19th century. So therefore, if you're from the right and you're criticizing mass migration, Islamization, and you really want to look for the root of all these problems, for the real cause, then you have to follow back all the traces back to liberalism. And therefore you have to criticize capitalism also, because otherwise you can't fight this liberalist system. And this is basically one of the core concepts of the European New Right. And of course, one or two of its most controversial points, since unfortunately today this bourgeois society is basically what we call the political hegemony. So everything in our society has been pierced by these liberalist bourgeois ideas, and therefore every one of us is basically a bourgeois, lives in the spirit, the mentality of the traders. Of course, at least we who want to oppose the system are trying to get rid of that, to become different, better versions of ourselves. And this is basically also the call to action of the European New Right, of traditionalism, of the fourth political theory, that we surmount this trader mentality, this dominance of the economic principle, and become heroes again. Be able to bring sacrifices to fight against this globalist system, and of course change our very mind and our perception of the world.
Yeah, I think you made a really important point to highlight the fact that since capitalism is the economic system of the ideology of liberalism, this is why it's problematic that so many so-called conservatives just want to go back to maybe a slightly earlier point in history, whether it's the American 1950s, whether it's the 19th century, and sort of go back to a point where that development was already on a very particular trajectory. So going back is not going to solve that problem. It's about going back to the root. And of course, the other important point you made was about that separation of the individual from all traditional ties, right? So initially it was religion, then we got to other ethnocultural traditions, then we get to the question of gender, and of course in the post-historic world, and I'm using this with big quotation marks, it's about the splintering of the individual within himself, and where that individual hence the, the gender madness of these days that we see all over the media whenever we log in, whether it's the Olympics or something else. But it's about this ability to have conflicting identities within one individual, because they're almost like different clothes that you can put on and take off, right? You can be a Catholic, but you can also be, let's say, transgender. Like all those identities can be combined because they've been completely disconnected from their meaning, from their roots. And so it's almost about putting on these different hats. And this is what you talked about. For those listeners who are not familiar with the work of Deleuze and Guattari and that kind of progression of liberalism as an ideology. And today, some people would say that because the two other modern ideologies are effectively dead on a global scale, liberalism was the only one that remained. But clearly, we are kind of in a more post-liberal world today. And you might have noticed that we called our episode after the end of history. I'm obviously not the first one to do this. I think ever since Fukuyama published his end of history treatise in the 90s, has been criticized. Personally, when I read that book, I was kind of shocked by how brazen it was, considering how early it happened after the collapse or within the collapse of the Soviet Union to be making such broad predictions. Like, there was no waiting time to see whether what Fukuyama was thinking of would actually come to pass. And of course, Francis Fukuyama is considered to be probably one of the most well-known American intellectuals, which kind of says a lot. In France, it would probably be like someone like Alain de Benoit in terms of the caliber. So it's very interesting. And so it seems like we keep going back to that moment in time, the 1990s, right? We go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We go back to the sort of the changes that are happening within the new right. We go back to what you're talking about in Europe, where it seemed like there might have been a hope of, okay, finally, we don't have to deal with the Soviet Union, but maybe we can also be free of the American influence to the extent that we had it. Do you think there was that kind of hope in the 90s in Europe in terms of politics?
Yes, it definitely was there. It existed, at least for a brief moment. But unfortunately, Europeans themselves were not able to either put it into practice or were actually restrained by their American allies to put this sovereignty into place. It's very interesting. Some years ago, I visited a speech by Alain de Benoit, and we talked with him about the European Union and if he actually is holding the opinion that you could somehow transform the European Union into a European civilization state, being not a subject to the United States of America. And it's very interesting that he said that the European Union, from its very beginning as European community, has been basically an American project in order to stabilize American hegemony in Europe. And that it's very bureaucracy, its structures are under transatlanticist influence. So it's basically not possible to hijack the European Union and suddenly transform it into Imperium Europa or something like this. But the European Union is actually simply an American project and vassal state. And you can only fight for the birth of Europe if you're actually leaving the European Union, because the European Union as such is more or less a project to destroy what's left of European identity. And we can, I think, see it the best way in the European Union's behavior towards Russia. Since the latest escalation in the conflict between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, that the European Union is actually an anti-European project, only used as some kind of weapon by the Americans in order to destroy Russia. And therefore, I think it's totally hopeless to think about that this sovereign Europe could actually be created out of this European Union, but you can only create it without the European Union. And therefore, I think the current developments are actually not that bad, because the dynamic actually points into the direction that the European Union will be in very grave difficulties in the upcoming years. And yeah, from a patriotic new right perspective, I'm actually very fine with that, because as we say in German, besser ein Ende mit Schrecken als ein Schrecken ohne Ende. So better you have a horrific, you have an end with horrors than horrors without an end. And yeah, I think that's where we are actually heading now.
Very dark, very dark, but very poignant. Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of times when people think about the growth, the establishment and the growth of the European Union, they usually say, oh, it was meant to be this additional pole in multipolarity that was supposed to balance out, you know, the American pole, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting that you highlight the fact that, you know, probably going back to the Marshall Plan in those early stages of the European Union, of all those, you know, the 1950s, the coal community, et cetera, that those institutions that came to be thanks to the Marshall Plan that was established by the Americans kind of had that system embedded in them. And so if the entire institution of the European Union developed out of that system, you can't kind of fight the system from within the system if it was developed in a very particular way, because it's been sort of in motion on its own for quite some time. And I think another great point that you made is that a lot of times people conflate Europe and the European Union as this one thing, although it can be two completely separate entities, right? You have this massive bureaucracy, which is not necessarily in some ways completely not synonymous with what Europe was and what some people would say Europe should be. So that's really definitely really interesting, but it's also kind of dark to look at it in this way. Very Heideggerian in a way. So you touched upon, you know, the relationship between the EU or Europe or individual continental European countries and Russia. This is something that, of course, we've discussed on this channel a lot. Where do you see that development progressing?
Well, I would say that in Europe, you currently have two different political camps. You have, on the one hand, states like, for example, Hungary and Slovakia, who are actually opposing this radical war policies actually put into practice by the European Union against Russia. So, of course, officially, the European Union is not fighting against Russia in Ukraine, but if you look at the sheer quantity of European weapons sent to Ukraine, if you look at the very fact of European military specialists being present inside Ukraine and basically fighting for Ukraine, and then this armada of Western secret services, most prominently the MI6, but as we knew from scandals of the last month, also the German military services, etc., are actually conducting espionage operations against Russia, also in Ukraine. You can see that the European Union is actually leading a war against Russia, but it just doesn't want to publicly admit it, since it knows very well that at least no Central and Western Europeans are basically ready to fight against Ukraine, except maybe for some crazy fascists who already went there and either died or are still fighting there. And therefore they have to lead this unhonest war against Russia, where they send material, billions over billions of euros in order to prolong this conflict, because they themselves know that they are not able to beat Russia militarily on the battlefield, and therefore they simply try to prolong the agony of the current Ukrainian regime, which is unfortunately killing its own people in this very process of leading this suicide attack against Russia. And basically you have this disparity in Europe. So even, for example, in very pro-Western countries like Austria, the majority of the population is against the prolongation of this war. But of course, they still are voting the same political elites who are actually continuing this whole process. And therefore, it's continuing. And unfortunately, also, most of the current strongest opposition parties inside Europe are maybe a little bit pro-Russian, but if you're really looking at them, in total, they are mostly neutral. And therefore, they simply want to return to a splendid European isolation with better relations with Russia, but also not friendly relations, since all these people are somehow caught in this imagination that they must defend an old version of liberalism and enlightenment, and therefore still they think that Europeans themselves are somehow superior to Russians. And yeah, therefore you have no, or at least no sizable, really pro-Russian political opposition in the parliament. And yeah, this political course is continuing, but fortunately, they are getting more and more problems. The economic situation in Europe is becoming more dire and dire with each day. And now you have, especially in Great Britain just recently, even more and more riots and a growing dissent inside society itself, which is of course in dissolution. And therefore Europe at the moment is somehow going on the one hand in this more authoritarian and anti-Russian direction on the one hand in terms of its elites, but on the other hand its peoples are actually going in a different direction, and this dissent is actually growing. So therefore I hope we have now the right time in order to spread revolutionary thinking, revolutionary ideas, which of course means the propagation of the idea of multipolarity, the idea of the propagation of a sovereign Europe, of a sovereign civilizational state, and of course it also means an end to liberalism and to transatlanticism.
May I enter here for a second, because you said several things that, for my understanding, I mean, I'm going to take down the level of discussion, because so far it's up here, and
of course,
you know, for me it's going to be really down. But you said some things that caught my attention a lot. I mean, last year I've been to Vienna, beautiful city, fantastic city. I mean, just you cannot imagine that going back to third world, okay? Just like most of Europe, all right? So I live in Italy, and Italy, when I moved here, I came from Switzerland, and I moved to Italy, and people say, "Are you crazy? You came from Switzerland to Italy?" I said, "Dude, I'm from Rio de Janeiro, you know? Switzerland, Italy, Rio de Janeiro." In terms, of course, I'm not just smearing my city. I mean services and security and all that. But you mentioned well, first of all, you used back in the beginning, you used the term radicalized. And that's interesting, because I was just watching the UK movements right now. And the answer from the state is, okay, we are going to imprison all these people that's making a mess. And they are even talking about, you know, controlling retweets. That's fantastic. You know, you retweet something, you go to jail. and the first thing that came to my mind is like, look, the guy is pissed off. Everybody's pissed off there. And then what you do, you're going to give the reason for the, you know, and you have to acknowledge there is a problem of immigration. Basic. And they're going to give the reason for those that these people are considering a problem, and you're going to jail these people. These people are going to be radicalized. You know, these people are going to look around and say, look, the state doesn't care about me, and let's go to a bigger scene. Hungary, Okay, Hungary is trying to do everything to save his own face. Let's not be hypocrites here, but yeah, a little bit of European Union because it's on their own interest. And what Europe is doing, European Union is doing, is, you know, with this oil problem with Ukraine, they're just saying, okay, Ukraine is right, your problem. So I'm part of European Union. And then you say, the dude that's not part of European Union is right and you're not going to protect me? Why am I doing here? Why am I doing this? And then you mentioned the thing that people are going for one side and the oligarchy is going to the other side, because that's my perception as well. I mean, average Joes here in Italy, they just don't care about geopolitics. I think that's everywhere. But more and more people are getting worried. More and more people are creating YouTube channels or Instagram or TikTok or whatever and just talking about this. So there is a waking up of people. And I hate to use this term because people start thinking, oh, this woke thing. No, it's another kind of waking up, please. It's really waking up. And so I said all that to ask you, how do you feel it is the temperature in Austria? You know, the people, you just mentioned, yeah, people are, but how far is it for people to really wake up, look around and say, I did not sign up for this?
Well, I guess the temperature is rising, but so far the pot didn't boil over, but it's still somehow under control. So, for example, as a consequence of the escalation of the war in Ukraine in 2022, inflation skyrocketed in Austria, like everywhere else in Europe. And suddenly people realized, okay, if we are still supporting these kind of policies, we will become grave problems in the future. And then, of course, you have still this kind of looming threat of war, which is also hanging around the heads of the people. And they realize, okay, if Russia, for some reason, should no longer restrain itself, we could also become actually part of a war we actually didn't want to take part in.
And let's be honest, purple rare people is not ready to fight.
Exactly, yeah, because of course Nina talked before about Fukuyama's end of history thesis, and I mean, you can definitely criticize his ideas, and of course they have to be proven wrong, have been proven wrong. Even in the same year, his book was actually released, as far as I know. But the Western elites and Western societies, especially in Europe, were really defined by this mindset of the end of history. I remember when I was back in high school, my geography teacher told me when he was looking at the map, and he said, you see, now Romania joins the European Union, and there you see this huge country on the map, that's Russia, and I bet we will all see the day when even Russia will join the European Union. So these were predictions in the early 2000s, and they were, of course, still influenced by this, Fukuyama's thinking that we will all see the global dominance and the end of history of liberalism. Of course, it hasn't turned out like that. But yeah, unfortunately, the spirit of the end of history still permeates European society. For example, you have, for example, really huge opposition parties like FPÖ in Austria, which is said in the polls that it will become the strongest party in the next parliamentary elections, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the youth movement of FPÖ is basically non-existent. There are only these, basically
old
functionaries of the old farts. They are basically these functionaries of the party, and maybe a few young people following them. But the youth, as such, is not active inside FPÖ. They are simply staying out of the party. I mean, for various reasons, some of them are good, but this is just highlighting the very phenomenon of depoliticalization, which is also existing in Austria to a certain degree, because most people are really fed up about the political scandals of the last decades on the one hand, but on the other hand, really liberalism has also pierced through the people and influenced them in a way that they're only focusing on their individual needs and are no longer thinking about community, about the need for struggle, about the need for improving oneself, but they have basically melted into consumerist society and are now somehow melting together with the floor, and everything is becoming the floor. Nobody wants to strive for the skies. And this is really a grave problem, because it actually makes this political change slower if, and this would be the worst case, if it not only makes this political change impossible. And therefore I can somehow understand certain Russian elites grouped around Vladimir Putin, for example, who always said during the last decades when they looked at Europe, they said, okay, Europe is basically a lost case. You can't expect the Europeans to do a revolution on themselves or a real political change, because they don't have the power for that anymore. And this is actually the thing, the very thing, political dissidents like myself have to fight against, because there is basically this unsatisfied, this disgruntled youth, but they are not doing anything. They are really passive and really consumerist, individualistic, and we have to somehow find a way in order to make them heroes again, make them think about their own tradition again, make them to think about God, about our society. And this is, I guess, a very hard process.
I'm going just to say that, and I'm going to leave you free for the rest of the show, I promise.
Okay.
No, it's while you were talking about this thing, this reasoning about Russia, we could tolerate each other, but we don't want to be friends, and we have to keep holding a little bit to liberalism and all that. Do you know those, what was it, 12 steps of denial, denial, negotiation?
Yes, I know.
Those I never know all of them. That sounds like a advanced stage until someone realized.
Before acceptance, grief,
before acceptance.
Bargaining. What is it? The seven stages of grief? Bargaining.
Exactly, bargaining.
Anger, bargaining, and finally acceptance.
That sounds like, you were talking there, and at the same time that I'm very pessimistic, realistically pessimistic, I was, sparkling a little bit of hope, because that sounds like an advanced process of acceptance, that reality is knocking the door, and at some point you have to open it. And do you feel I'm too far away from reality at this point by being, allowing myself to be a little bit optimistic?
Yeah, I think since I'm a Christian and we are Christians, we are all, as Daria Dugina has put it, eschatological optimists. So when we are looking at the end times, we are positive that Jesus Christ will defeat the armies of evil. And I think we also have to think in this direction. We are actually fighting not only for a political change right now here in Europe or elsewhere around the world, but we are, of course, taking place in this eternal fight of good against evil. And therefore, we have to be optimistic, because if we are not optimistic, if we are just pessimists, we are actually not able to change anything, because we have to open up a perspective. We have to show the people the possibility of multipolarity, of a different economy, of a different society, in order to convince them to go a different path in the life, because this is everything a proper political crisis is actually about. It's about the path splitting, and you can choose either go left or go right, or choose the same path as before and go to your decline, or choose the path of rebirth, of renewal. And that's the way we have to show the people. I will just have to go for 1 second and get my charging cable so that I'm not handling the discussion right now. So just a minute.
No worries. Well, Marcelo, we're surviving your power outage. I think we've lasted longer than we expected to last.
Someone want us to broadcast. Someone.
I know someone wanted, maybe not on YouTube. And by the way, we apologize for any crashed.
YouTube is going.
It's going.
It was cut for a couple of minutes. But then it's broadcasting. I checked it, but my Bluetooth keyboard is not working, so I was trying to write to you there.
No worries. No, that's okay.
Okay, so we have him back.
Perfect.
Right.
So I guess my statement before my question was going to be that one step lower than pessimism, which is understandable, would be nihilism. And I think modern Western and maybe global culture is so nihilistic that we probably don't want to head in that direction, because we could see how bad it. Well, maybe we haven't seen how bad it can get. I don't want to bite my tongue.
It can get even worse.
It might get even worse. So that would be my first statement. Right, exactly. But my other question would be, it's not so much about being friends between, let's say, maybe we could leave Britain out of this one, but let's focus on continental Europe, right? Mm-hmm. Continental Europe and Russia. It's not so much about being friends. It's about having some kind of mutual interest and shared ideas and having mutually beneficial interactions. Wouldn't you say that the very geopolitical reality of being neighbors kind of necessitates that kind of cooperation? Kind of like Marcelo said, eventually reality will knock on the door. You're always going to be neighbors. So at some point, you're going to have some kind of fruitful interaction. Much like we had earlier, where, on a very basic level, Russia was supplying cheap energy, which was one of the reasons behind the so-called European miracle. How do you view geopolitics in this sense, sort of the reality of geopolitics being neighbors in relation with European, maybe not necessarily EU, but European-Russian relations?
Yeah, well, basically when it comes to geopolitics, of course, I'm following the ideas of Carl Schmitt, who basically just readopted Plato about this thinking of the contrast between land and sea. And of course, sea civilizations are basically people who are striving for profits, who are striving for surmounting borders and endlessly expanding, and therefore also behaving very ruthless and brutal. Like, for example, the Vikings in the Middle Ages, or the English for most of modern history, and now the Americans.
The Japanese in the first.
Yeah, of course, the Japanese are also an example for that. And then, of course, you have also land civilization, which is more conservative, rooted in its very space, rooted in its earth. And therefore, they have to adopt a more mild approach when communicating with the neighbors, because they have to live with them together, as you said before. And when you're thinking about, for example, Austrians and Germans and Russians, of course, we are basically part of this civilization of the land for most of our history. Unfortunately, the ideas of modernity have actually destroyed things like the Drei-Kaiser-Bund in the 19th century, for example, when Austria, Germany, and Russia were trying to contain liberalism. And a great Austrian statesman, Johann Wenzel Fürst von Metternich, actually tried to create a global anti-liberalist system, together with Brazil even, in order to contain the United States and England. So these were different times. I think when we look at
we were
history
very relevant at some point.
Yeah. I think if you are looking at the very histories of our peoples, even in the West, we can see that there once was a very conservative, traditionalist approach in our societies. We were more directed to God than to wealth. And I think we have to reconnect to the spirit in order to create a better future. And of course, this means realizing one's own interests. And if you say, okay, we as Austrians, as Germans, as Europeans, we actually want to coexist with Russia and coexist in peace, because we know World War I and especially World War II have actually only led to devastation for both of us, and actually made it possible that the United States, for example, became a dominant political force in Europe. We somehow have to work together. And I think you have currently today institutions like, for example, the BRICS states and other organizations, which are actually doing what Nina talked about, realizing common interests, formulating common policies in order to also bring them into a geopolitical form, so to change the political landscape and also international political alliances. And I think the BRICS states are actually starting this very concept of multipolarity, which was reformulated by Professor Alexander Dugin already back in the 1990s in Russia. And Russia itself is actually taking here a leading role as some kind of avant-garde of multipolarity. And therefore, it's only natural and intelligent for all those peoples around the world who are not in favor of liberalism, of American hegemony, of these endless wars, that we are actually joining forces with Russia, and that we are trying to create at least some kind of alliances, so that in order we don't end up fighting wars we don't want to have. And I think this is the important point, where we have to push the people, the ordinary people in Europe there with their nose at this very important fact, and make them basically realize that they have to change this policy, because otherwise they won't have a future, or at least only a very grim future. And this is basically the very basics. This is the geopolitics 101. We have to make more popular, especially together with the idea of multipolarity, because unfortunately, as Nina has highlighted also before, certain mindsets from the Cold War, certain imaginations about the nature of the Russian people, which are, at least in Poland and the Baltic states, are still seen by some people as some communist maniacs and mass murderers, something like that. We have to change this perception. And of course, we can do this also if we say, look, there are these Russian ideas, they're actually in favor of peace, they're in favor of cooperation. So why don't we simply end this endless confrontation between Europe and Russia, because it's actually not in our interest. And this is actually the very hard task to make people think, to really make them think and get out of their role as zombies, like in the movie They Live, where actually people are also not able to think, but they are simply eating the propaganda fed to them by the aliens. And nowadays, like in this great movie by John Carpenter, we also have to start rebelling against these globalist aliens actually dominating us.
Well, I think it's interesting because in the past year, we've seen multiple European leaders visit China, and that, I would say, North American attempt to damage the relationship between various European states and China has essentially failed, because Europe is realizing, or at least various European states are realizing, that it's sort of necessary to cooperate with China. And I think if you extend that to the fact that a lot of Chinese projects like Belt and Road kind of incorporate Russia, or at least any future projects have to go through the Eurasian continental landmass, again, you're sort of faced with that reality that whether you like it or not, and if you're working with China, you're going to have to work with Russia too. So eventually, I think that reality, at least the optimist in me, will come knocking on the door, at least again for continental Europe. But the other thing that's interesting to me is that we've had Austria's former foreign minister, Dr. Karin Kneißl, on here, and she had a lot of very interesting things to say about Europe in general, about Austria specifically, but ultimately, as you know, she left Austria and she no longer lives there, which to me is very sad, having to leave your homeland. So what is it like for you to be a political dissident? Now, obviously, you're not a high caliber politician like she is, who was kind of forced out. Again, that says a lot about the climate in Europe. But what has your experience been like being sort of outside the mainstream?
Well, if you're outside of the mainstream and if your ideas are more leaning to the right, then of course to this totalitarian populist center, or to some kind of new Marxist thought, you are basically getting ostracized in society. And I mostly experienced that when I was part of the identitarian movement. So of course you had these lazy university students posing as anti-fascist street fighters who wanted to confront you, but when you pushed them away, they left you alone and things like that. But of course, what they were basically trying is they were trying to intimidate you, to make your life less pleasant. And then you are sitting, for example, in a seminar at the Department of European Ethnology, and I had a professor from the United States sitting there at the table, and I was talking about Gustave Le Bon and the psychology of the masses, and suddenly those people storm in with ski masks on their faces and distributing some kind of pamphlets against me that I'm an evil fascist, and they have to kick me out of the seminar and everything. And of course, I knew who from these people inside the seminar actually launched this whole action there. And then I had to talk with them for the rest of the hour about my political beliefs, together with the professor. And then the professor just said, because back then I was still in the identitarian movement and everything, and he said, well, I can understand most things Alexander talked about. I cannot identify myself with his anti-Islamic beliefs, but besides that, he's just a normal guy, so leave him alone. And that's basically what's happened. Of course, this had also grave repercussions. For example, in 2018, the Austrian state actually started a juridical case against me for being one of the founding members of a criminal organization, like the Mafia, for example, and they wanted to throw me in jail for 3 years, something like that. Fortunately, I got an acquittal, and this was, of course, a giant waste of resources to a certain degree, of course, and I also had to spend my time in order to drive every day for a month to the provincial court of a smaller city in Austria, 3 hours away from Vienna, just to be present in this completely absurd political case. And of course, I'm still having sometimes certain problems, but of course, as a Christian, as an Orthodox Christian, I know that God is only giving us trials and tribulations we are actually able to stand, which we are actually able to master. And therefore, I see that somehow with a certain degree of joy, if there's some political opposition coming from open enemies, and therefore it's not that big problem. I think the bigger problem is all these indecisive people, either on the radical right or on the radical left or on the center right, center left, who know, okay, we can't do this with liberalism anymore. We have to find some ways out. But then they see people like you who are talking about the solutions, and then they say, no, maybe your direction is right, but this is too radical. You cannot say this and you cannot say that. And of course, therefore, this whole struggle becomes harder. But I think this is basically what it means to be a political dissident. It's not meant to be a pleasure, or as we say in German, es soll ja kein Vergnügen sein. It must be hard, you must struggle, otherwise you can't get out of it.
You must suffer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it always amazes me how these Antifas in the West act essentially as the stormtroopers of the regime, even though they like to think of themselves as being opposition figures. It's just really just blows my mind how there's no self-realization at all about what function they play for essentially the governments that don't like the ideas that you might be spreading. But I wasn't aware that you actually had was it a criminal case, a political criminal case?
Yeah,
and if so, did you?
Case.
It's unbelievable. Did you have it's almost like we've had, our Polish dissident who was actually in a Polish prison for his opinion. So it's almost like we have this, we have people having to leave their countries because of it. It's just absolutely kind of a very, I guess, in a way, a pessimistic view of the political atmosphere in these Western states today. Did you have an attorney, and how do you even defend yourself? I mean, the accusation is so vacuous and so vague. I don't even know how you would address that. Did you have a lawyer representing you?
Yes, of course, we had back in those days a very good lawyer who basically took all these accusations one by one they made against the whole identitarian movement, and then basically destroyed them in front of the court. And our judge was basically very desperate when he saw all that happen, because he also failed to put some well-known Islamists in Austria into prison, and then he just put up this huge case against generation identity, and he also failed against that. And if I'm having nowadays some juridical problems, of course, I also have now another lawyer who was even a dissident back in the Soviet times, but in Hungary. So I hope that also my future confrontations will end up well. But of course, you can never know. It's definitely possible that, for example, one day the Austrian state says, okay, this one here is a dangerous dissident. We have to give him election. We have to put him for some completely absurd claims into jail for 2 years. This is totally possible. But I think about that in the direction that, of course, if there is an evil machination you're fighting against, and if these forces of evil really want to, then they can, of course, put you into jail. At least they are not taking you from your home and shooting you in the streets, for example. I think this is at least some kind of improvement. So it's right. Or like this famous quote goes, defeat is just an illusion until death. So even if you have setbacks, you're not dead. You can still continue your work. Maybe it's not easy, but it is basically what it is. And if you're a dissident, unfortunately, you need to fight. You have to fight. You need to develop a certain iron will. And if I'm thinking about these things, of course, I'm thinking about the great Russian martyr Daria Dugina, who actually took all these fights to the very conclusion, and even unfortunately went into death for them. But this is the utmost consequence you could witness for this. And unfortunately, as we know from all these Ukrainian kill lists nowadays presented, it could even hit some dissidents in the West like us. But this is unfortunately the state of affairs, and we have to change that.
The Ukrainian kill list, which is always sort of mocked at in the official Western media, if it's mentioned at all, I think is definitely kind of remarkable, the damage that is done to multiple journalists and intellectuals that have lost their lives. And yes, there is that, you could say the connection might be fairly loose, but the fact that people's names were on the list and some of these people are no longer alive, like Daria, whom you mentioned, I think is just absolutely shocking, just on its own, excluding anything else that's gone on in Ukraine, while, the European Union promotes it as this utmost democratic state that just needs a little bit of reforming before it can join the European Union. But what I am curious about, as far as I guess if it just, again, a very practical question, why was your legal case in a more provincial court as opposed to a more central or a federal court?
Basically because in Graz, which is the second largest city in Austria, so you have Vienna with like 2 million inhabitants, and then comes Graz with 300,000 to 400,000 inhabitants. And in Graz, you had unfortunately a judge who was very politicized in a sense of very liberalism in the model of Karl Popper, like liberalism 2.0, and he definitely wanted to make an example. He wanted to bring some young people into jail. So yeah, that's the whole world sees Austria is not silent in the face of this new kind of racism, which definitely endangers our society. And yeah, therefore,
would you say Germany and Austria are, or maybe Central Europe or parts of Central Europe, are more authoritarian than other parts of Europe, at least in your experience in this regard? Or is it really kind of random?
Well, I don't think that it is random, because if you are looking, for example, at the history of Cold War, with the terrorism in Germany and also in Italy, you had a certain political interest in this so-called strategy of tension, which was also developed by NATO generals. And basically it led in Germany to a stronger censorship and to a weakening of the socialist resistance back then in the Cold War against liberalism. And yeah, Germany, as many US politicians have said, it's basically inside the heart of Europe. And therefore the need to keep Germany, whatever it may cost, inside the Western camp, because otherwise they lose the world island, as McMahon has put it. And yeah, therefore I would say the most authoritarian state in Europe is actually Germany, since Germany is very important for the elites in Washington, on the one hand. And you could also see this, for example, at the ban of the Compact magazine in Germany, which was one of the few pro-Russian magazines there. And they simply banned it for obviously no reasons besides they hate Compact magazine and they hate them for being in favor of multipolarity and in favor of Russia. And Austria itself, you say in Germany and in Austria, Austria is somehow a society which is 20 years behind the German society in all developments of postmodernity and of radicalization of the ruling party, etc. And therefore our globalists are still somehow behind Germany, of course, but they are trying to catch up. And yeah, this means, of course, that it's also becoming more and more unpleasant for people like Karin Kneißl, who, as you mentioned before, was unfortunately really driven off out of Austria, just because she differed in some opinions from the ruling elite. And yeah, I think they will do this with more people. But let's say what the changes in the next few years in Austria will bring, because you have this growing unrest, and sooner or later this will have consequences also for the globalists. And then, of course, they will not be able to prolong these authoritarian policies. Yeah.
Right. So do you separate Austria and Germany into kind of two separate cases, or do you view them within the same paradigm, culturally, politically, ideologically?
Well, basically, of course, there is a lot of common things between Austria and Germany, especially if you look into history. Austria basically emerged as a kind of Bavarian colony back in the Middle Ages. And of course, there's no such kind as an own Austrian language, but we are definitely speaking German, of course, with some dialect variations. And yeah, therefore we have on the one hand a lot in common, of course, but then also a lot separates us. But yeah, it's more like a relation between brothers. Maybe you can compare it to Russia and Belarus, for example, or White Russia, or between Russia and Ukraine and some of the CSTO states. So Austria took its own development, because basically until the 19th century, Austria and Germany were not able to be separated because Austria had dominated Germany via the Holy Roman Empire and was basically the leading political force. But then, of course, with the fight for German hegemony between Austria and Prussia, Prussia, of course, at Königgrätz defeated Austria, and therefore Austria had to follow its own way. And it's very interesting that from then on, Austria again turned its gaze eastwards and tried to reorganize the Balkans, tried to establish its own hegemony there on the Balkans, which unfortunately then brought it into conflict with Russia again. So yeah, there's a lot of things uniting us on the one hand, and on the other hand separating us. So if, for example, if you're talking about Austrian and German mentality, of course, this is the biggest difference. So the Germans, or this what is nowadays called Germany, is mostly influenced by Prussia and the so-called Prussian spirit. Also, of course, by the more industrious cities in the north of the former Hanse and the Rhenian capitalists Karl Marx wrote about. So the Prussian spirit, it's more strict, it's more disciplined, and it's more earnest in everything. And what really characterizes the Germans is basically that they want to overfulfill their duties. So you have, for example, this term called vorauseilender Gehorsam. So basically, forwards marching obedience. So the Germans want to be as political correct as possible. They want to be as globalist as possible, only so they can satisfy their masters in America. And therefore, of course, you had before 1945, you had this really extreme and chauvinistic and genocidal nationalism, which was basically also born out of a perversion of this German spirit, of course. But then after 1945, it simply changed and became a very obedient form and extreme form of liberalism, which was cultivated in Germany. And of course, this is the modern German mind. And of course, there's also the traditional German mind, which was, I guess, the best represented by Martin Heidegger, for example, who showed that there is also a mystic Germany, a Germany which is able to feel something like empathy and to basically experience and embody Dasein and not only the Gestell, which is actually now dominant.
Not pure rationality in the machine. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And Austria, on the other hand, is a bit different. So since the end of World War II, and especially since the 1970s, we were basically forced to be our own nation, independent from Germany, on the one hand, and even before that, Austrians were generally more Slavic, you could say, than the Germans in the north, of course. And so we are more ironic, we are more lenient. Some people would say we are more lazy than the Germans, of course, but we are also better able to feel and show empathy towards other people. So this made us maybe great in diplomacy during the last few centuries. And therefore we are not...
This is a sign. This is a sign.
It's time to take her to pee.
Well,
what was the term that Dr. Knassel used?
She said Austrians are basically German-speaking Slavs. So it was just kind of amazing that you said the same thing. And I think our previous audience was kind of fascinated and shocked by that statement. So having another Austrian kind of validate it was very, very interesting. And I think we must do some kind of an episode on that, because I think to us outside of that domain, it sounds really just fascinating. It's not the way we think of Austrians. Again, I think usually Austria and Germany are perceived as a sort of the same or a similar entity, right? Culturally, politically, etc. So yeah, we don't really think about these differences. So it's really helpful having this kind of commentary coming from you.
But you made fantastic Wurstel.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously.
Vienna.
Obviously. But I guess I'll ask, maybe my last question, Marcelo might jump in as well. To go back to the question of Ukraine, which keeps popping up here, you talked about, initially you qualified it as a war between NATO and Russia, but then you talked about the European Union essentially being in this undeclared war. Do you sort of see the EU bureaucracy and NATO as kind of being interchangeable? Like there's not even a reason to differentiate between the two of them, or do you see them as kind of two separate entities?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you can say that European Union is just the civilian branch of NATO. And especially if you look at people like Ursula von der Leyen, who has been before defense minister of Germany, one of the most important NATO countries, and now being head of the European Union, you see there are some communicating vessels here at work. And that you cannot separate the European Union and NATO. And therefore, as Alain Benoit has said, the EU is part of the problem. It's not a part of the solution.
So do you think there are any of these kind of rumblings that are going on within, you periodically hear about we must have our own European defense, we shouldn't rely on Americans this much, and then it kind of dies down, and then some other country brings it up and nothing ever comes to fruition. Do you think it's possible for this to happen? Maybe not immediately, but maybe in the medium to the long term.
I think in the medium to the long term, it is actually necessary to have some kind of own European defense. Of course, integrated into a broader Eurasian security architecture, which was actually proposed by Russia already at the end of the 1990s, I guess. Because, of course, I'm totally in favor of European independence and European army being able to defend us from American influences. But I'm deeply afraid of the consequences a European army would have right now here at the European level, because then it would be definitely used by the globalists inside the European Union in order to march against Russia, like a new episode of Napoleon marching to Moscow, or Hitler trying to Barbarossa the USSR. So therefore I think at the very moment it would be very dangerous. But fortunately, the European economy is not providing the basis for creating such a European army, because it's right now at its last legs, basically. And in order, of course, to create an army, you need a strong economy. And fortunately for Europe, it doesn't have that at the very moment. And therefore, this would be a topic for the future. And then I hope it will be also a topic being discussed in a wider Eurasian arrangement, and not only just for Europe itself, so that we can finally really create an order of peace and not an order of never-ending war and chaos.
So do you think, I guess I said it was my last question, it was my second last question. So do you think one of the key focal points of the war in Ukraine, in reality, not what the propaganda tells us, was to bring Europe down into further dependency and make it more economically dependent, partly thanks to cutting it off from Russian energy, but also for other reasons? Do you view it in this way, or do you think this is something that would have happened anyway?
Well, I think the main reason for the war in Ukraine was simply to fulfill this American dream of destroying and decolonizing Russia. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, the first and foremost reason. And the thing about weakening Europe was just the second thing, when the United States realized, okay, there are still people inside Europe, even in the European elites, who want to make peace with Russia, who wants to get out of this quagmire, and therefore Nord Stream 2 was actually destroyed by the United States, because they knew as long as this possibility exists, Europe will have the chance to actually leave the Western alliances. And now they are somehow trying to basically blackmail us into submission. And I don't really think that this will really change, for example, under Donald Trump administration, because also Donald Trump wanted to bomb Nord Stream 2. Unfortunately, he didn't have the chance to do it. But unfortunately, of course, American geopolitical interest as such won't change, even if you have a more isolationist US-American elite. But of course, they will better the overall circumstances and maybe give Europe a little more room to breathe and to slowly emancipate itself from this unipolarity it is currently causing.
I guess I was looking at in terms of going back to liberalism, capitalism, where capitalism functions based on expansion, and it ran into a problem of there's no more places to expand to. So therefore, we need to bring down something to build ourselves back up. And Europe is a good place to bring down because we cannot expand anywhere else. And so I kind of looked at it not just in terms of geopolitics, which of course is extremely relevant, probably the most relevant factor, but also in terms of capitalist economics here, expansionist capitalist economics. So,
yeah, I think you mentioned a very important thing. The European hybris. Prince Nikolai Trubetskoy already described in the 1920s in his groundbreaking work, Europe and Mankind, where he actually stated the fact that European cosmopolitanism and European chauvinism are just two sides of the same coin. And nowadays you could say that actually the rainbow flag and the swastika are actually just two sides of the same coin, because they both have this destructive and expansionist tendencies, which are actually nurtured from this European hybris of the modern European mind. And I think one of the most important things for us Europeans is actually to learn that our culture and our civilization are actually not universal, but they are very particular. And we have to think about our own borders, and not only in terms of mass migration, but also in terms of our own superiority complex and in terms of our expansionism, and to stop that and just to be content with our own selves, with our own borders, so that we can become a normal part of the multipolar world. Because I know definitely all of you know this meme from this bad horror movie called The Babadook, I guess it is, where the mother is driving inside the car and suddenly the child possessed by the demons starts to scream the whole time, and then she turns around and says to it, "Please just be normal."
Yeah, please be normal.
and when you look at the history of the last 200 years, I guess the West itself, and also unfortunately Europe, is basically a screaming child in the back of the car. This
is how we know we live in post-modernity. We can reduce our hour and a half discussion to a meme.
Exactly.
Please just be normal. Which is very poignant. Marcelo, do you have any parting questions for us?
No, I think we went for
as a fellow kind of European. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the only consideration would have, and that's an ignorant question, it's that is it necessary to keep within the political spectrum? Like, do we need to be called? My concern is that when I built my channel, I built to create bridges. So I talk with you the same way I will talk with, far left, central left, whatever people consider themselves, as long as they can be constructive, of course. Mm-hmm. Do we need to keep this, this political spectrum, left, right, whatever? Can't we just, decide that some things are bad, some things are useful from every part of the spectrum, and can't we start? Because I think this brings the first barrier, to dialogue. And I see this in my channel. I see this in my social experiments, in WhatsApp friends. It's the first thing. Who did you? There's even a meme. Since you mentioned meme, there's a Twitter account, a Brazilian, Joaquim Teixeira. He pretends to be an old guy. And, during Olympics, just the other day, Brazil got gold medal in gymnastics. and he posted it on Twitter. Can someone tell me if she voted for Bolsonaro or Lula so I can commemorate, celebrate or not? So, do you think we could start dialing down this spectrum and start creating new ideas about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, basically, I'm also a friend of this approach of creating bridges, and also communicating, for example, with those parts of the left who also want to really change our situation, who want to better it. I'm totally in favor of it. And I think one of the worst things that could happen to a society are actually what is going on right now in England, for example, where you have these people from the right fighting these Antifa guys and those very fanatic Protestants fighting with people who are in favor of Muslim jihad and some versions of it. I think this is actually the worst thing that could happen to you, because a civil war, like in this famous movie by Alex Garland, which is, I think, not a coincidence that it was just published a few months ago, and in advance of this elections in America, I think a civil war is actually the thing which the globalist system actually wants us to lead, because then it can rule unopposed. But we are not striving for a civil war, I guess, but what we need to strive for as dissidents is actually a political revolution, so that we have now then afterwards a political elite which is actually not in need of a civil war and another civil war in order to stay in power. And therefore I totally agree with you in the term that we have to discuss with with people at the other end of the political spectrum who are also in favor of change, of course. But if you have people in the European Commission like Ursula von der Leyen, or also all these crazy journalists in the mind of George Soros, who just want to destroy Europe and wage total war against Russia, I don't think you can discuss with these people. That's impossible. And therefore, as you said before, we have to reach out to all those people around us, even if they are from the other end of the political spectrum, and talk to them, communicate with them, maybe even form some alliances in order to better a certain situation or strive for a common goal. But of course, with those people who want to see us dead, we can't make an alliance, and we can also not reach out because they want to see us dead, and they are the enemies.
I think it's two separate things. One thing is that the political compass is very outdated, like we talked about earlier. To take this to very basic ideas, if you tell someone that you oppose mass migration, they will say, oh, you're right wing. And then you tell them, but I also support universal healthcare and I do not support foreign wars. They say, oh, but you're left wing. How does it all mesh together? And people don't really understand that you don't have to fit into this one of the four squares on the political compass, that it's who told you that you have to. You don't have to follow a particular political party. So that tells you by definition that it's not really working as well. I mean, yes, it can give you a pretty okay basic idea of where you stand, but it's really very limiting. At the same time, we don't want to say that ideas are unimportant. That's one of the first things that Alexander said in this stream, is that activism, yes, it may have some relevance, but essentially you have to go back to ideas, and ideas, in my opinion, too, are primary, and anything that comes from them is secondary. And yes, you can maybe disconnect ideas from particular modern ideologies and try to build bridges, but you cannot completely get rid of ideas and just operate on some kind of impulses or something like that. So I think it's kind of like two separate things that are related but not the same, that Marcelo, you mentioned. So
that's why I like intelligent people. They can formulate phrases better than me.
Well, thank you for the inflated compliment. And I think we've been going for quite some time. This has been one of the most elucidating conversations I think we've had on this channel. We didn't get to talk about culture and aesthetics. This is the question that I wanted to discuss, but obviously we had so many other questions for Alexander, who is a wealth of information and knowledge, philosophy, ideology. So maybe we'll have him back on another channel. Maybe we'll do a multi-parter on Austrians Ukrainians being secret Slavs, because we've now had this.
That's
we
a
now
very
had this
important
mentioned.
topic, I guess. Yeah.
It's an important topic. It's a topic that people had a lot of reception to too. Now, none of those people were from Austria, but everyone was really curious about that question. So maybe we can even do like a 2-part or a 3-part episode on that. But yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. We really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully we can have Alexander back to talk specifically maybe about aesthetics and how culture, society, how those questions fit into what's been going on politically, geopolitically, and ideologically. Before you go, why don't you tell us what you've been working on now? You said you're going to get back into publishing. I'm curious what that would be.
Yes, so in the course of the last years, I started translating books. So, for example, the German version of The Great Reset Against the Great Awakening by Professor Dugin was also translated by myself. And yeah, during the last year until just very recently, I worked on the first draft of the translation of Eschatological Optimism by Daria Dugina, which was thankfully translated into English by Jave Arnold and John Stachelski. So yeah, I've now finished the first draft for bringing it into German. And yeah, my plan is in the next few months, if God wills so, I will then publish it in Austria and for the German-speaking space. And yeah, start my own publishing house, publishing books from the new Eurasianist movement, basically on multipolarity, philosophy, the conservative revolution, and other aspects. And also, yeah, trying to create some international cooperations with that. And yeah, basically enlighten the German language space a little bit more. So in order to turn more people into German-speaking Slavs, and also draw the right geopolitical conclusions from that. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. And, you know, as someone who's translated a little bit, it's very, very particular, finicky, thankless work that's also very important. So if anyone, even if you're relying on partly, auto translations, and then you're going back to, to check and to correct it, it still takes a very long time. So if you guys out there have never translated anything, even with all the technology we have today, it takes a long time. It's more of an art than a science. And yeah, it's amazing that you're trying to bring all these books to German speakers. Thank you so much for being here. Well, we hope to have you back again to talk about things that are a little bit, related, but maybe outside of the political realm. Marcelo?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexander. So this is
and we are linking all your socials. We're linking your website if people want to come and look at your work. It's going to be in the description.
Yes, this is the third Dugin translator in my channel, so I'm in trouble, I would say. So yeah, thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you, Nina, and everybody that watched us today. I'm not sure much people watch this now, but they will for sure watch us later. Thank you very much, and I apologize for all the technical issues. It was completely unforeseen this time, I promise. The other times, they were pretty much foreseen.
I mean, your electricity was on, so we can thank whatever higher power intervened, to give us electricity in Italy.
Perhaps the Putin have sent a little bit of metric cubics.
He's like, I'll press the red button. They're talking about multipolarity. We'll press the red button for just this one occasion.
Yeah, I think I'll just keep the stream going so I can still have light for sleeping.
You can have some lights, yeah.
Thank you very much, guys. All the links are in the description. Remember to like, share, subscribe. Subscribe to Alexander Marcovics. I'm sorry, it's Marcovics. Markovich.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Alexander Markovich Twitter, Instagram, and follow his work. Subscribe to Nina on YouTube and Twitter and Rumble, and also her blog, her site. And see you guys next time. See you, Nina.
Thank you, guys.
See you, Alexander.
See you when we see you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Bye-bye.
Bye.